Hello, and welcome to our presentation about supporting autistic adults achieve their employment aspirations. My name is Dr. Susan Pryor, and I'm a member of the National Autism Implementation Team, known as NAIT. Today, I'm co-presenting with my colleague, Dr. Marion Rutherford.
This slide has our social media and contact information. There are lots of free resources on our website, and we look forward to adding more employment-related material over the coming months. If you are tweeting today, you can follow us on @NAIT Scotland. Our team is involved in work across a range of areas you can see here. Collaborative working across sectors is key to all of these, and this presentation particularly focuses on employment. There are other NAIT sessions in the conference that you might be interested in, and NAIT Making Things Happen gives an overview of all of our work. And there's a session focused on diagnostic pathways in children, on education, but for now we'll focus on autism and employment. A principle underpinning all our work is that support should not be diagnosis dependent. The focus is on identifying and meeting need, but we recognise that timely diagnosis is important. NAIT are therefore focused on developing and sharing good practice for autism in the attainment and retainment of employment, recognising that relevant support must be provided before, during and after diagnosis. The presentation today will provide a brief summary of co-occurring conditions, in particular mental health conditions, and why this is pertinent to employment. We will emphasise the importance of autism and employment, providing a bit of context to the issue, and we'll also discuss pathways to employment and diagnostic pathways and where these may overlap and intersect. And we'll conclude with news about our next steps. We recognise that autism rarely presents in isolation and commonly co-occurs with other neurodevelopmental or mental health conditions. Therefore, there is value in taking an evidence-based approach to intervention. For this reason, we're drawing from research from several fields: employment support, neurodevelopmental approaches, and mental health rehabilitation. It's also possible that mental health issues arise in the context of challenging transitions from education into employment or due to stressful work experiences. This might lead to an individual seeking an assessment for an autism diagnosis. I'm sure we're all aware that employment is an important issue for autistic people, but just to emphasise that we understand that work is generally good for everybody's physical and mental health. And what's more, employment is included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone has the right to work and to protection against unemployment. It's important to acknowledge that figures we're sharing reflect the old normal, and the news today is full of headlines about rising unemployment figures. But if we look at employment rates pre-COVID among the general population of working age adults, almost 83% were in employment. This falls to 49% among people with a disability. As I'm sure you're aware, National Autistic Society research found that only 32% of autistic adults were in employment, and only 16% in full-time employment. Or to consider this another way, half of autistic people in employment are working part-time. In the general population, only around a quarter of those in employment are working part-time hours. These figures are in stark contrast to the 77% of unemployed autistic adults who aspire to be in employment.
There's recent research focused on desirable characteristics reported in autistic employees. Whilst it is essential that we keep in mind that every individual job seeker has their own personal strengths and we don't fall into a stereotyped view, this research indicates that there are desirable job skills which are commonly observed among autistic people. For example, attention to detail and concentration, persistence and problem solving, and creativity, good memory, love of learning, reliability and loyalty, trustworthiness, fairness, and kindness. Some autistic people may possess specific skills like artistic skills, mathematical abilities, or technical abilities. I'm sure that you will recognise many of these logos. Many high-profile companies and industries are discovering the benefits of hiring autistic adults and have strategies in place to actively recruit autistic candidates and support autistic employees. However, the journey to employment can be complicated and require many transitions. leaving familiar environments, establishing new relationships and new routines. We know that fewer autistic school leavers move straight into work than those with no additional support needs. Almost half of school leavers with no additional support needs move into university, while this drops to a quarter for autistic school leavers. Around 3/4 of university students with no disclosed disability leave university straight into employment, but just over half of autistic students achieve the same. The majority of autistic school leavers go on to college or other positive destinations like voluntary work, training, personal skills development, but it's unclear how successful these routes are to eventual employment. As I've previously said, diagnosis is only helpful if it makes a meaningful difference in life. The NAIT team has a focus on pathways for assessment and diagnosis across the lifespan. We take the position that support can be enhanced by diagnosis but should not wait for diagnosis. Autistic individuals and families send a strong message that diagnosis is important to them. Although it doesn't or shouldn't change the support provided, autistic people and their families tell us that timely diagnosis helps them to understand and access relevant information now and in the future. So an autistic person who has not been diagnosed may experience difficulties during transition towards employment. This may highlight a need for diagnostic assessment, a diagnosis which might be helpful in accessing specific support. We also recognise that individual journeys and experiences towards employment may be helpful in informing diagnostic assessment. Therefore, the NAIT team, in consultation with the autism community, will develop a resource for individuals seeking diagnosis to prepare for assessment, reviewing their own strengths and needs in relation to employment. An individual may choose to do this with their family members, employment support worker, or employer. When a diagnosis has been made, it's essential that individual aspirations and strengths inform all interventions. If the individual has an aspiration of being in paid work, the goal should always be employment. Where needs are identified in the diagnostic assessment, these should lead to reasonable adjustments in the employment environment. Resources developed by the NAIT team, in consultation with the autism community, will support the individual to reflect on their own personal aspirations, their strengths, and then to consider if it might be helpful to share any needs for reasonable adjustments with employers or employment support workers. So, how can this be achieved effectively? This tiered triangle may be familiar from other NAIT presentations. Improvements in practice for supporting autistic adults needs to happen at all these levels. Fitting with our principle that support should not be diagnostic dependent, we believe that establishing universal inclusive practice will benefit everybody seeking employment, and indeed those in work with or without a diagnosis. Therefore, universal support should be aware of autism and mental health issues. Individuals may require additional adjustments over and above inclusive practice, and the NAIT team role is to support a graded approach which should be evidence-based. So, to begin to populate this triangle with some examples. Universal support to obtain work could be through Job Centre Plus, or perhaps support through Skills Development Scotland, for example, through an apprenticeship. For those requiring additional individualised support, Fair Start Scotland provides employment support to help people living in Scotland to find work. We know at the moment small numbers of people with developmental differences are supported by Fair Start Scotland. NAIT will work with Fair Start Scotland to ensure more autistic people who want to work can access their support. Fair Start Scotland and other more specialised services are seeking to adopt evidence-based approaches, for example, individual placement and support and project search. These should be tailored to best support autistic individuals. Many of these services support individuals to obtain employment, but that's not the end of the journey. And services should also continue to support job retention and career development. This is done in partnership with employers. Legislation requires employers to consider reasonable adjustments, and NAIT hopes to work with Healthy Working Lives to ensure good guidance is available to all employers. During COVID, we have shared key messages for employers supporting autistic employees. There are some simple ideas that can support many autistic employees at any time. For example, think about clearly defined spaces, Create and maintain routines, avoiding too many unexpected changes. Where this is possible, consider how to promote opportunities for movement and allow movement breaks across the day. As with any employee, think about matching work tasks to areas of skills and interests. Anyone under stress may not find it easy to seek advice and help, so think about ways to support conversations, perhaps a check-in with a key person, or other ways that people can indicate a need for help. It's important to listen to the individual and to think about what has and hasn't worked in the past and be prepared to adapt support over time. The journey to employment can be complicated and require many transitions, leaving familiar environments, establishing new relationships and new routines. We know fewer autistic school leavers move straight into work than those with no additional support needs. Almost half of school leavers with no additional support needs move on to university, while this drops to around a quarter for autistic school leavers. Around 3/4 of university students with no disclosed disability leave university straight into employment, but just over half of autistic students achieve the same. The majority of autistic school leavers go on to college or other positive destinations like voluntary work, training, or personal skills development. It's unclear how successful these routes are to eventual employment. As well as effective support, we need to think about how to reduce barriers. This could include negotiating reasonable adjustments in the workplace or at employment support services. Barriers to getting employment could require adjustments in the recruitment process, increasing awareness of employers of the positive reasons to recruit autistic candidates, and the possible need for some reasonable adjustments will be key. This approach will also assist in reducing barriers to keeping employment, promoting ongoing dialogue about performance and adjustments. Obviously, this is also easier when a good match is achieved between the individual and the job requirements and the work environment. Over the coming months, the NAIT team will be working with service providers to support inclusive practice and to establish effective pathways to evidence-based services tailored to the needs of autistic people. We shall be developing resources to identify aspirations, strengths, and needs to inform diagnosis and the requirements for reasonable adjustments. We are working to ensure that the high priority given to employment in the ADHD Adults Good Practice Guidelines recently published by the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Scotland is reflected in all neurodevelopmental services. And finally, as COVID context leads to a rise in unemployment, services will need to adjust and adapt and change. Let's recognise this as an opportunity to make sure that new and revamped services are appropriate to the needs of autistic people. Thank you.